Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I am looking at episodes 3 and 4 of Foundation, the new series on Apple Plus TV. If you have watched these episodes, great, you'll be able to follow along. And if you haven't and you don't want spoilers, you might want to not watch this video just yet. I did recap episodes 1 and 2 in a previous video, so perhaps check that out. Now, a few things I want to talk about briefly before we actually get into the episodes. There was some news today as I record this on October what is today? Today is the 8th of October, and this is the day of the 4th episode's drop. And Apple today announced that they are renewing the series for a second season of 10 episodes. Each season getting 10. That's pretty much kind of the industry standard these days for dramas on streaming services. And it was a very interesting decision to come this early in the season. They are very happy with the results so far, and I think this is fascinating because apparently their numbers as far as views and how they measure that on the Apple platform are good enough for them, or perhaps they're just so heavily invested in the series as a prestige series that they just don't want to give up on it after one season. I think if you look at these first 4 episodes, you do see there's a lot of mixed baggery going on with what we've seen so far. In fact, the reviews critically have been okay, but very few people who are actually jumping out of their seats and going, woo, boy, this is going to be the great new thing in science fiction. And the audience reactions have even been less thrilling. In fact, just I took a look today at Rotten Tomatoes, where 71% positive rating for the critical response, and that's solid. It's nothing spectacular. Most series tend to do a little bit better than that. But the audience response is only 60%. And I checked out some other review services as well, and their audience response levels were following a bit into that category. So one of the things that's interesting I've talked about the series so far is that it is very much in the lines of hard science fiction. It is very much a spectacular series visually, but this series does have some issues in terms of its narrative structure that have been a bit confusing and have kind of monkeyed around with some things over the first few episodes, and I'll talk more about those in detail later on. But one of the things that's fascinating is as I have looked at the audience responses to the show, a word that I see coming up an awful lot is the word boring. Now, boring is a fascinating word because it's hard for a lot of times people to define what they mean by boring. Usually they're judging something in relation to something similar that they have viewed, or in the case of books, something they've read before. And boring simply means it could mean it's very slow for them, but it also means they just don't understand it. Their brains are not wired to kind of get it. And I think that's going to be a real problem for Foundation to establish itself over time. I'm not sure that a modern mainstream audience is going to stick with this show. I hope they'll give it a chance, but most modern science fiction tends to have a high octane presence. There's a lot of excitement. That's not happening too terribly much in this series. This is a much more thoughtful, contemplative series, even though it's visually spectacular, and there are moments. There are moments of excitement. There are mysteries. There's some suspense. But I think that's going to be a little bit of a problem. Also, what we find is a lot of humor in modern science fiction, especially if you throw in the Marvel and DC universes. And I realize those are comic superhero adaptations, but they do go a lot of times into the science fiction realm. They do go into space, Guardians of the Galaxy, and so forth. So I think people are used to action and they're used to humor. And you're not going to get much of that in this series, at least not so far. In fact, the humor has been almost non-existent. This is a very, very serious and somber show. So it's going to be fascinating to see where this is going forward. Now, to get to episode 3, let's talk about episode 3, and I want to just briefly recap where we are coming into that. After the first 2 episodes, we had established the premise that Hari Seldon has said that the Galactic Empire is going to collapse, and there will be centuries of darkness and savagery across the galaxy. We learn that there's a plan to start the Foundation on the distant planet Terminus, and that will then build the Encyclopedia Galactica and basically be a repository for all human knowledge so that the next empire can form a little bit more swiftly. We also see in the second episode, here's where we go into some spoilers, by the end Hari Seldon is killed, and that's pretty much where we've left off there. We also see a dramatic event involving the Empire and the Anacreons and the Thespians that will come back to have an impact on our story later on. So that takes us then to episode 3. And episode 3 spends almost half of its time not explaining the murder of Hari Seldon, but in fact dealing totally with the emperors, Dawn, Day, and Dusk, and the history of the emperors over their 400 years since their cloning process began. We basically spent about 20-25 minutes focusing on the final days and the death of Brother Darkness. This is the stage at which he has gone beyond dusk and now is coming toward his end. Now, this really, to me, it signaled that we're going to be with these emperors a lot later on in the series, but I don't know that I particularly cared for this. It was interesting as they kind of think about their own legacy and their own sense of their place in time. That's great. But is the story about these emperors? Or is it the story about the Foundation and the preparations to build a new empire as the old one falls? And I think that second one's really where this story is going. So I really felt this was quite a waste of time. We spent about 20 minutes watching Brother Darkness go to his final stage, which involved walking into a room under a beam of light and then dissipating into dust. And that's how the emperors end their lives. It was a little touching, but again, also I thought an incredible waste of time. And so now we are 35 years later. We are on Terminus. We have the Foundation. We see the settlement here. And now we get into the story of Salvor Hardin, who was actually introduced to us in the prologue of the first episode. And we learn that Salvor it could be someone with a certain kind of a mystical potential here. We have a vault, the levitating vault, that has been on Terminus since Seldon's team first arrived there. They don't know what it is. It creates kind of a null field around it, and only Salvor seems to be able to penetrate that null field, has some kind of connection to it. Now, those who have read the book, as I have, know what should be in that vault, and that should be coming up soon in the series. But nobody else on the ground does know. It's one of the interesting mysteries of the story. Now, 35 years have passed, and we really don't get any of the time elements filled in there. We don't really know the ending of episode 2, why Hari was killed, what happened to Gal Dornick, who it appeared was framed for his murder, and a character we thought was going to be maybe the central character of the series, but interestingly enough is still the narrator. So the Gal Dornick is the narrator. We hear this voice from time to time guiding us along, but Gal's no longer with us, or at least we assume as much. It's a part of the confusing narrative structure. Now, Salvor is having some visions as she approaches the vault. She believes that there is something coming, there's a crisis coming, and indeed there are Anacreon battle cruisers approaching Terminus, and there is a bit of concern about what they may be up to, because Terminus is technically an empire settlement, and the Anacreons, who suffered greatly at the hands of the Empire, really are not going to be too pleased with them. By the end of the episode, we do see that there are Anacreons have penetrated the camp. Okay, so now episode 4 is really quite fascinating, and this may give us a much better idea of how this series is going to move, at least to the first season, than did episodes 1 through 3. We begin to see the threads of the narrative begin to piece together. We begin actually once again on Trantor with the emperors, and we discover that Brother Dawn, who is now sort of a grown teenager, is clearly struggling with his identity. We actually begin with him leaping off the balcony and crashing to the ground in what should have killed him, but discover that he's protected by a type of shield. And later on, we discover through Brother Day that each of these clones have a kind of shield. Brother Day calls it an aura, which protects them against kinetic energy. So that's kind of an interesting development. But we also learn that there is a major religious schism taking place which could affect up to 3 trillion people and perhaps throw the galaxy into chaos. And this schism is based on doctrine which could imply that the emperors are less than human because of the fact that they are clones. And if the schism takes place, it might reduce the emperors to less than the type of godlike figures that they are, and that, of course, can be nothing but good. So Brother Dusk, who originally made the decisions 35 years ago to bomb Anacreon and Thespin back to the Stone Ages as a punishment for bringing down the Star Bridge, he is going to go off-world to deal with this religious schism. However, Brother Day, who is now the primary emperor, never liked the decision that Dusk made 35 years ago, and he tells Dusk, no, you're going to stay here. You blew it the last time. You set all these events in motion with your horrible, rash decisions. I'm going to take charge now. Well, we'll see how that goes. So that's kind of what we're seeing happen on Trantor. But the bulk of the story is taking place on Terminus, and this is Salvor developing and understanding her connection more to the Vault, which is it's growing and growing, and we see her actually have a vision that puts her back in the Grand Imperial Library on Trantor, with the place where Hari Seldon worked. So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I kind of know as a reader of the books what that vault is. I would expect in episode 5 we'll probably see the resolution there. But the big story there is the Anacreons. We learned that a fairly good-sized force of them have managed to land on Terminus. Now they can't directly invade the city because the city is protected by a massive shield, but they seem to have some kind of a plan that can get through it. They promise to raise the city. However, as it turns out, they are led by this hunter goddess who is a very high-ranking figure among the Anacreons. And we learn about the past. We learn about what is fueling the Anacreons. And there's a lot of rage here that dates back 35 years to when their world and Thespin were bombed. And it's understandable. We learned that 50% of their population of Anacreon died immediately, and another 20 to 30% within a year. And now, at this point, Anacreon does not have the ability really to travel and take their people to other star systems to start a new homeworld. So they came here looking for the technology to help them do it. So that's pretty much a lot of the plot. Now there is a big scene at the end. If you, again, I'm assuming you've watched this or you wouldn't be watching me now. A big moment at the end. It almost feels like an end credit, an after credit kind of moment where we find that ship from the end of episode 2 when Gal Dornick was basically framed for the murder of Harry Seldon, and sent off on a shuttle into the middle of nowhere. We never knew what happened. Well, now we see a ship approaching that shuttle, and Gal Dornick is in kind of a stasis tube of sorts inside there. So now we're going to learn about what happened to her. Presumably, she has not aged over this time, and this is how they're going to bring her back into the story. I am glad that they are dealing with this issue. I was concerned about episode 2, what exactly is going to happen here. But also, I wonder, she knows who killed Seldon, but probably doesn't understand why. What will her details mean when she reveals them to whoever this is that's about to rescue her? So some really interesting things developing here. Potentially a lot of conflict is coming, but there's still a lot of elements of this story that really require a very, very close viewing, and I think narratively are a little confusing. I think for a lot of viewers, this series remains something where you can get the general gist of what's going on, but you're not necessarily understanding a lot of the terminology that's being thrown around. That is a potential problem because, look, the story, the series is trying to talk to you at a very high level. I get that and I appreciate it, but sometimes we do feel that we're kind of at a distance because very, very little is being explained to us. So this is going to be fascinating to see where they go with this first crisis that Harry Seldon predicted. And I'll be especially interested in comparing it to how it took place in the books. And I'm really interested to see Gal Dornick and how they bring this character back, because this would be something very different than what we saw in the books. So it's going to be interesting indeed. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. Please like it and comment on it below. Agree, disagree with anything. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to the channel would be super mega cool as well. And I'll be back probably in a couple of weeks looking at episodes 5 and 6. So until then, bye-bye now.